And welcome to this edition of Live Fire on the Gun Owners News Hour. It's a pleasure to be able to have joined me again Lowell Ponte. Not too long ago, hopefully you might have been listening, and we interviewed him about the fourth book in a series that he and a co-author have been writing. This one is titled The Great Withdrawal, and we discussed how the progressives are making a mess of so many things, particularly our money. But we wanted to turn to some relatively contemporary topics and look at some gun control issues. Can you imagine on the Gun Owners News Hour? We might actually talk about guns. But Lowell Ponte is up for many, many things. He has been a talk show host himself, and I guess there's 8 more volumes that you're considering in this series, of which The Great Withdrawal is but one.
That is true, Larry. Hey, wonderful to be with you. You're on the show where the tension mounts, dismounts, and mounts again. We look at what the government is doing to us. Also, greetings from California, where, like so much of the rest of the nation, the progressives long said, well, we want assault weapons and handguns and so on. But we honor hunters in America. We will never go after hunters' long rifles and shotguns and so on. Well, in California, as of January 1st, they are now, in effect, registering every rifle and shotgun. And
I believe they are either have already or are on track to make you use environmentally friendly bullets and not those nasty lead bullets.
Does that mean we can use depleted uranium? like the tank guns? I don't know.
Well, I'm not sure I'd want to use that myself, although it would be tempting, but the cancer risks are somewhat a consideration. But
no, this is something that you're going to see in much more general terms. As Mr. Obama has less and less influence over the Congress, he is going to govern purely by regulation. The thing the Congress refuses to pass, he will simply order a regulatory state like the Environmental Protection Agency to create in law. Most Americans don't realize we have about 15 regulations in America for every law that Congress passes. So the regulatory state actually has much more power because those regulations have the force of law than our lawmakers themselves.
Yeah, he's told doctors, I don't know with what authority, but nevertheless, as you say, he is quite happy to rule by diktat, the Russian word for executive order. He told them to ask patients how many guns they have. And I read just the other day that at least one doctor will not take you as a patient if you do not surrender that information. It's kind of getting out of hand.
It is indeed.
Imagine.
And especially since information given to your doctor used to be confidential.
No more.
Now all of this simply becomes a matter of government record retrievable by any ambitious politician or bureaucrat. And this takes me back to the days when I used to be the roving science editor at Reader's Digest for 15 years. And back in that era, under Bill Clinton, you'll remember, he had the Centers for Disease Control studying gun injuries to children and deaths of children as a medical issue.
The
so
epidemiology
medical policy to ban guns. The only catch is, in order to get statistics that showed any result at all, they had to define a child as anyone up to age 22.
They had to take in the gangbangers.
Yeah, basically those were the only quote-unquote children shooting each other were drug people fighting over turf.
Yep, exactly. And back to that hunting concern that their leader has for us, the argument is that lead bullets pollute. Well, there's a Dr. Proctor down in, I believe it's Dallas, but he's a Texan, and he's a very well-known toxicologist, and he's actually written, and we have on our website at gunowners.org, probably in the fact sheet section, some years back, it won't take much trouble to find it, a piece where he analyzed the whole issue of lead pollution. And lead that goes into a berm, when you shoot a target and it goes through that target, hopefully, and goes into the berm, it's going to do absolutely nothing. It doesn't matter if you shoot it into a stream. Nothing will happen. If a condor gets a lead pellet, it'll probably help clean out his gizzard, that's all.
As I said, by the way, I was a science editor at Reader's Digest, and one topic I was very tempted to do, we had this whole list of topics we'll never be allowed to do, many of which are hysterically funny. But one of my favorites was, if you look at some of the most liberal cities in the United States, when they were doing gold mining in Northern California, they used a great deal of mercury in order to get the gold out of the soil. And as a result, there is to this day massive mercury contamination of much of the soil of Northern California, and will be for the next 5,000 years. That does mental damage. In fact, you know the expression, mad as a hatter?
Yes.
That's because people who used to make hats of beaver skin and so on, they used mercury, they handled mercury in processing the hats.
Oh, here
and they would tend to go insane. They would tend to develop very strange mental symptoms. So that's the drinking water that washes down to San Francisco.
Oh, well, that might explain it.
Meanwhile, in places like Boston, in New England, they have very high levels of aluminum in the drinking water. And aluminum, too, has been associated with Alzheimer's disease and other mental deterioration. So if we ask, where does liberalism come from in America? Apparently a good deal of it comes from brain-damaging chemicals.
It's in the water.
Otherwise, in the drinking water.
You know, we make fun of the water here in Washington, D.C., but maybe, like some of these other places, we really shouldn't drink the water here. I know I drink bottled water all the time. I have a still in my house that purifies the water, a Berkey system.
Oh, I thought you were like George Washington there for a moment.
No. His
had one of the largest whiskey stills in the United States at Mount Vernon.
No, I don't grow my own corn either. I just purify my water. But
that's what's always fascinated me, Larry, that we've had a policy now under Mr. Obama and before him where if you drink alcohol and then drive, you're in trouble. But you are required to make your car drink alcohol. It's just peculiar.
Well, I think hopefully what we've seen this year was such an overreach and such a bald-faced lie in which the president got wrapped around his own axle with, that just maybe we're going to find out in a few months just how much the American people don't like what the government has been doing, especially now that they know what the government has been doing. You can keep your insurance policy if you like it. Indeed, I think that's where the Democrat Party, all of whom in the Senate voted to renew or to fund zero care, even in the face of Senator Cruz's efforts, I think they might have really finished themselves off. We're going to see. It's going to be a great movie. Get lots of popcorn. Going to be back and talk some more with Lowell Ponte. Used to be the science editor at Reader's Digest, and now is helping us see through some of these current issues. My guest today is Lowell Ponte, and we're talking about a range of subjects. By the way, his most recent book, The Great Withdrawal, is part of a series intended to be 12 long, but it's an analysis and a chronicle of how the progressives, let's use a more accurate word perhaps, the socialists, the Marxists, have really messed our country up. They haven't finished their job yet, and Lord willing, we're going to stop them from doing that this coming November. Lowell, I'm still struck by this report that you gave us of the mercury pollution in Northern California mountains, which washes down into the drinking water for San Francisco. And maybe there is actually something in the water that makes people in different locales, shall we say, the way they are?
I use the term progressive. It is, of course, a collectivist philosophy. In Europe, it manifested or metastasized into both communism and Nazism. Here, it metastasized into something quite similar. I mean, here, the major early progressive leaders, such as Woodrow Wilson, were very big on eugenics. They were saying if someone is a criminal, if someone is mentally defective, as I define it, sterilize them. Just eliminate their ability to have offspring. And even Barack Obama's science advisor, his first science czar, is John Holdren, was co-author of a book that had advocated putting chemical sterilants into the world's food and water supplies with government to control the antidote. Meaning, if you wanted to have a baby, you would have to go to the government. You would have to go to Barack Obama on your knees. You would have to go to a government bureaucrat and say, please, 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 let me have enough antidote that my wife and I can have a child. Needless to say, if the progressive leader you were facing at the moment was Adolf Hitler, and he was part of this greater progressive movement...
Let me home in on that point for a minute. I think that's extremely important, and so many of us that have been subjected to government schooling do not understand what you just said, and I know I've mentioned it on this microphone before, but I think it bears repeating that Nazism is simply a form of leftist ideology. Call it progressivism, call it socialism.
The very word Nazi is simply a contraction of the German words for National Socialist.
National Socialist Workers Party. Alan Colmes could not get his mind around that. He was so stuck on, the Nazis were on the right. Well, they fought the communists, didn't they? Yeah, well, have the mafia ever fought one another also? They're all...
Actually, from time, we have in this latest book a long passage denouncing capitalism and how we must do away with individualism and greed and so on. And you read that to young, inspired leftists, and they will applaud and cheer. And then you say, this is the official party program of the Nazi Party issued in 1922.
Bingo.
I mean, the rhetoric is identical to the rhetoric of the left here. The main difference historically between Nazis and communists was Nazis would kill Jews because they were Jews. Communists would kill Jews because they were capitalists.
And I think...
But either way, they were bent on killing Jews. So.
The Nazis did leave a few more industries nominally in place, even though they were highly regulated and had to do whatever the Nazi commissars told them to, but they seemed to realize that there would be somewhat more efficiency if there were some private incentive remaining.
The efficiency is enormous, and this is where socialists in recent years have come to realize the Nazis were smarter than Karl Marx, because the Nazis realized as long as you leave the owner of Krupp weapons or whatever with a piece of paper saying that he owned the company, then they could make him pay property tax on it.
And he would
the problem that socialists had in Western Europe is they would expropriate the coal mines and everything else, and then they would say, gee, why has government revenue plummeted? Oh, when the government owns things, you can't tax the government as the owner of it.
And frankly, the incentive of the management team is going to be,
well, you see, this raises the question, what really is ownership that we get into in our latest white paper on regulation? In the book, we say we are now undergoing what we call regulation, which is a revolution by regulation in the country. And the point being, if, as happened under Nazism, the government can tell you, what you must make, who you must hire, how much you must pay your workers, and on and on and on. If they can tell you every little aspect of what you can do with your property, then what does it mean that you own a piece of paper that says you own the property? It means nothing.
Right.
They're dictating it just as if it were socialized or nationalized. The only difference is, as I said, you have to pay property tax on it. You therefore have an incentive to make enough money that you can pay the property tax.
Absolutely. We now call this, what you and I are describing, crony capitalism. Folks, that is simply an American translation for Nazism. Because that's what Nazis were crony capitalists.
Nazism or fascism, yes, but when General Electric survives only on government contracts, and when General Electric is told what it can make, what it has to charge, what racial profile it has to hire, and so on, of workers, then what does it mean to be free enterprise anymore? There's very little freedom left in free enterprise in America. The person who pays the highest business taxes on earth among major countries.
Yeah, and especially if the company's located in California. The statist seems to have a pretty consistent M.O. Batista, who was a statist. He was a dictator in Cuba, and in fact...
but an interesting piece of trivia that my friend, the author Umberto Fontova, has pointed out to me. He was born in Cuba and escaped with his family. Batista, the left doesn't like to acknowledge, was black. Batista was part African-Cuban.
Oops.
If you go to Cuba today, and I've been there as a journalist, I was down in Cuba doing a piece not too long ago for the Los Angeles Times, you will find that every single person in a position of power is white. They are descended only from white Spaniards. All of the power is kept away from black people in Cuba. So they don't like to admit that white man Fidel Castro overthrew a black leader in Batista. Well, he's what the old Southern racist here would have called a quadroon or an octoroon or whatever, part black, part white. But he would qualify like Barack Obama as being an African-Cuban. And so we had a white man overthrow a black-run regime in Cuba.
Now, the thing that is so consistent in that statist mindset, be he black, half-black, white, whatever, the conviction that somehow he was born to rule over us and we were born to be ruled by him. Batista had a requirement that guns had to be registered. It was one way he was trying to defang Castro, who was already quite on the loose. And we see how much good that did for Batista, keeping Castro
well, I'm guessing it was
over.
Like when the Nazis moved into Norway.
Yep.
All they had to do was go to the city hall, pull out the gun registry rolls, and they knew exactly who had what gun.
And if you didn't have the gun, you were dead. This thing was so on Castro's mind that the first day of his being fully in power, January 1 of, I think, 59, he sent out his goons to collect the guns from private owners. These guys think the same way. Well, folks, thanks for being with us here on Live Fire on the Gun Owners News Hour. We're talking today about a number of issues involving the statist mind. Lowell Ponte has looked at it pretty extensively in his latest book, Is the Great Withdrawal. More to come as he dissects the thinking and the actions of those who think they have a claim to rule us. We've been talking about Batista and his government, and I may have known that Batista was probably rather racially similar to Obama, but I had long forgotten it. I'm glad you reminded us of that. A fellow that fled Batista's Cuba, and had it not been but for the hand of God, would have been executed by firing squad as a result of his efforts to overthrow Batista. Rafael Cruz, father of Senator Ted Cruz, got out of Cuba about 2 years before Castro took over. He went back after Castro had begun ruling and terrorizing and realized that it had gone from bad to worse. And so he returned to the United States, where he had ended up in Texas. And he's a great Texan, as is his son. These guys that have escaped tyrannical governments almost always get it more than most of their fellow Americans, because they've seen it up close and personal, and they realize that big government is not good for us average folks. It's a burden. It's often terroristic. It's inefficient, and it just is so arrogant that it's hard to take. I mean, look at our president right now. The guy clearly thinks so highly of himself, much more highly than he really ought.
Well, indeed, and this is the characteristic of progressives. They believe they're superior, they are philosopher kings, they are so much wiser than we are. It is their destiny to do what is good for us, even though we're not smart enough to see it.
Everybody in the faculty lounge agrees.
Yeah, and so like Michael Bloomberg, the now former mayor of New York City, they believe that they have every right to use the power of the state to tell you what you can eat, what you can drink, what you can say, what you can think.
If you can have a gun.
It will just be better if they rule everything, because they're so much smarter than we are. And this is why they felt perfectly empowered to sterilize people, to create, even under Obama's first science advisor, an environment where the government can control who is allowed to have a child and who isn't. By the way, no Jews need apply. for that. Or no members of the Tea Party. You've already seen them use the IRS, the controlling entity of Obamacare, in order to politically redirect power in the country, to give tax exemptions to leftist groups and to deny them to right-wing groups. And, that's a very Darwinian thing, but then the leftist, the progressive idea is that there is no God. Human beings, therefore, assume the role of God, and with enough science and big enough government, they can create heaven on earth for us if only we will stop disagreeing with them. And meanwhile, as to Barack Obama himself, here is a man who found it perfectly acceptable to give so-called assault weapons to Mexican drug gangs, even though those gangs often came into the U.S. and killed people here, too, all as part of a larger plot to manifest more gun control. He is a president who thinks nothing of standing aside and in effect, thereby facilitating Iran acquiring nuclear weapons, even though those nuclear weapons will quickly be handed to terrorists as their delivery system and taken it. I mean, the next time there's a 9/11 in New York City will be a large radioactive hole in the ground. But this man who has no fear of nuclear weapons, in fact, he's disarming the U.S. of our nuclear weapons. He's militarizing our police and demilitarizing our military. Barack Obama thinks nothing of nuclear weapons for Iran or of assault weapons for Mexican drug gangs coming into the U.S. But he's terribly concerned about the fact that you own a Ruger 1022. Yep. I mean, it's just intolerable that ordinary Americans be armed because, my God, that represents power in the hands of the people instead of in the government.
That's right. And power flows from the barrel of a gun, said Mao Zedong. He just didn't get into where power, in his mind, ought to be concentrated.
And by the way, this is why in our current book, The Great Withdrawal, which we'd love to give some of your listeners if you want to get a pencil and paper, we talk about how a Democrat group put out a pamphlet telling Democrats arguing on the gun control issue, make sure you don't mention rational discussion or law or the Second Amendment or what guns really do. Keep it entirely emotional. In fact, we saw the Washington Post recently actually put out a plea to their readers saying, please tell us your personal stories about how guns have hurt people. By the way, don't send in any stories about how you saved yourself from being attacked because you had a gun and could show it. But tell all the negative stories you can think of. We also document how Eric Holder, in fact, we show you how to view the videotape of Eric Holder before he became Attorney General, declaring that part of his mission was to brainwash people about guns.
Meanwhile,
they had been brainwashed about cigarettes.
All of these folks go about lecturing us about how dangerous guns are in our hands. They go about with bodyguards. My good buddy Piers Morgan has an estate, I'm told, in California where there are signs warning you that there are armed guards protecting Mr. Morgan. And when the now somewhat overturned Chicago gun ban was being promoted by, I believe her name was Mayor Jane Byrne, she went into the council chamber, and as she addressed the chamber from the floor, in a semicircle around her were 6 of Chicago's finest, and she was explaining that nobody needs a gun. Well, apparently those cops didn't get the memo because they were pretty well armed.
Well, an interesting thought about that, Larry. I have long argued, as you know, what the Communist Party just a few weeks ago implemented in China. And that is, they said, if you're a Communist Party leader, you are not allowed to smoke in public because it's a bad example to the people. I have always said, if a politician really is opposed to guns, then lead by example.
Thank you.
Lead by disarming your Secret Service contingent to show that gun protection is not really needed. By the way, you notice that one of the big pushes that the progressives have been making in recent decades is they force your child to take Ritalin when he's 6 years old in public schools because he's just too active, too dynamic. I bet you that in 20 years, when those kids grow up, there is going to be a move on the left to say, well, this child had to take Ritalin when he was 6. There's clearly something wrong with his brain. Therefore, he should not be allowed to own a gun.
And actually,
I can almost guarantee you they will do that. Now, what's interesting is Barack Obama is quoted by Mark Halperin and John Heilman in their new book, Double Down. These are two major Washington journalists. Double Down, Game Change 2012, in which they say that Barack Obama was overheard bragging to administration aides that, quote, "I'm really good at killing people," closed quote. Now, we already know Barack Obama, if he had to get a security clearance to work in the intelligence community, he couldn't get one because of his long association with violent radicals like Bill Ayers. He's commander-in-chief. Now, could he get, as someone who has boasted about how good he is at killing people, would this megalomaniac, would this man who wants total control over your life and mine and is clearly mentally unstable, would he be able to get a gun if mental health were enforced as a pure standard?
Well, and among the anomalies in his portfolio, in his background, he apparently has a Connecticut Social Security number. Evidently, however the numbers are sequenced, explains where you lived at the time you got your...
Yet he's never lived in Connecticut.
Never had any connection whatsoever with Connecticut.
Oh, Harvard was in Massachusetts. It's Yale that's in Connecticut. By the way, one other thought.
Maybe that's it. He might have gotten that Social Security number while he was at a Yale football game.
You notice that Toby Keith, who has long boasted that he is a Democrat, not a Republican, the country singer Toby Keith at his new restaurant has made his restaurant a gun-free zone, as did the head of Starbucks a few days ago.
Let's return to that.
Frank Fleming of PJ Media. Interesting thought about that.
Coming into a break, we're talking with Lowell Ponte, the author of the most recent book, The Great Withdrawal.
This is Live Fire. And here once again is your host, Executive Director of Gun Owners of America, Larry Pratt.
My guest today is Lowell Ponte, who for many years was the science editor at Reader's Digest. Most recently, the author of a book called The Great Withdrawal, and it goes into the mess that our country has been put in by people like our president, so-called progressives. Word works for me. If we find that the president is a crony capitalist, remember that's just the American translation for Nazi, because that's what the Nazis did. They left those companies intact. They just told them what to do, and they're so good at picking winners, Lowell. You just got to laugh. Most of these enviro companies that the president has subsidized have gone bankrupt, but not before the head of it put a whole wad of money into his own pocket.
With companies like Solyndra going bankrupt for $500 million.
Yeah.
That Solyndra, like 80% of all the green companies our taxes were made to subsidize, had people high in their executive ranks who were major contributors to the Democratic Party. Now, I know that's more or less de rigueur required if you are going to be a crony capitalist company, but it's purely it's like the labor unions. You know, you give us the power to force dues out of members and we'll split the dues with you, is how labor unions tend to work with the Democratic Party. One quick note. I mentioned The Great Withdrawal, subtitle, How the Progressives' 100-Year Debasement of America and the Dollar Ends. It's actually a positive book, but it shows you how our future could become one big national Detroit, bankrupt and a hellhole of violence and horror. If you'd like a free copy of this book, for the first 2,500 of your listeners today, Larry, just call a toll-free number. We'll be happy to give you the book. It's a $20 book at the bookstore. It is our little mission from God, my co-author Craig Smith and myself, just to arm people with information, which we regard as the most effective armament in the country, and the path to gold, guns, grub, the three things you will need in a real disaster. To get the book absolutely free and post-paid, just call 800-630-1494. That's 1-800-630-1494. Or as I like to say to help remember, it's a little like Columbus who sailed the ocean blue in 1492. It's close. Not
it's
quite
close.
that.
I was thinking
800-630-1494. 1494. Now, I mentioned the idea of should the president be disarmed? Should we have gun-free zones like this new restaurant by singer Toby Keith? Well, PJ Media commentator Frank Fleming had a fascinating observation about all that. He said, we should petition the Obama administration to eliminate armed guards for the president, vice president, and their families, and establish gun-free zones around them. Gun-free zones are supposed to protect our children. Some politicians, of course, want to make sure that Bill Clinton, for example, wanted a 1,000-yard gun-free zone around every school or homeschooling facility in America's cities, which basically, when you overlap those circles, there are no places left that aren't within 1,000 yards of some kind of school. So if you make that a gun-free zone, then you've made a gun-free country. But they're saying, or Frank Fleming wisely says, if gun-free zones work, then all the president needs to do is declare a gun-free zone around himself.
Exactly.
And all will be safe.
All will be safe. It's the hypocrisy of these folks, I think, has become much more apparent. I commented earlier that I think when the president got caught repeatedly, somebody counted 40 times saying, if you like your insurance policy, you can keep it. And you're a doctor, too. Well, okay.
Well, you know, in a piece about Toby Keith's decision, I mean, I'm not entirely unsympathetic to him. He declared that that decision was made with guidance from the state of Virginia and based on insurance regulations. Because of that, we have adopted a no-weapons. In other words, he was strong-armed by the insurance company and by the government not to allow guns in his establishment, even though they're allowed in the state. Now, this is a kind of untoward pressure. You and I remember, what was it, Luby's cafeteria in Texas?
Yep.
Where a gunman came in, and because it had a no guns in our cafeteria policy, everyone else in there was unarmed and like sheep for the slaughter.
The idea that the insurance companies have, that somehow people will be safer, there will be less accidental firearms discharge.
That's like the people who said, don't resist when someone breaks into the cabin of an airliner, because they'll just want to fly you to Cuba. By the way, by that logic...
Let me go back to your gun-free zone here for a second. They have not looked at the fact that all of our mass murders in our country in the last several decades have all taken place in gun-free zones. There was one exception, and I say this seriously. It was a Democrat political meeting, and typically Democrats don't carry guns either. So, but with that one exception, they were all, by law, gun-free zones. Even in the gun-friendly state of Utah, where you can have a gun on any campus, if you have a concealed carry permit, you're good to go. There was a mall shooting.
I have a wonderful thought for you, Larry, before it slips my mind. A slogan: gun-free is unfree.
Yeah, for sure. Because in that mall in gun-friendly Utah is where they had their one mass murder. It's just so stunning, and yet we have these insurance company actuarial numbers crunchers telling us that somehow it's going to be more risky in this guy's restaurant if somebody has a gun. Really? Luby's cafeteria, was it really?
Yeah, by that same logic, by the way, I found myself writing down, Toby Keith's restaurant should also allow no free speech. Because speech, especially when lubricated with alcohol, can lead to arguments and fights and lawsuits.
It can be so terribly offensive.
And so if we're going to get rid of the Second Amendment in his restaurant, let's get rid of the First Amendment, too.
And the police could be much more efficient, Lowell, if we just got rid of the Fourth Amendment so that they could come into any house at any time and search for anything they want with whatever methods they would like to use. No probable cause.
Of course, as you know, I've long been an advocate of the idea that you should be able to select your own law to some degree. For example, if you're against the death penalty, you should be able to post a sign in your front yard saying, this family opposes the death penalty, and therefore if you come in and kill us, we hereby petition the court not to sentence you to death. You know, when liberals have faced a similar thing, when people put in a liberal's front yard, this house is a gun-free zone, the liberals run frantically out to pull that sign out. Because they know what that means for criminals.
And then it may have been a
and the same
Photoshop.
The death penalty thing.
Yeah, well, this one house was next to a gun-free house, and so he put a sign up saying, "Gun-free house next door," with an arrow pointing to the guy's house.
Oh, that is great. I love that.
I imagine the relations in that neighborhood were probably a bit strained, but it's so easy.
If the guy really is opposed to guns, why would he object?
Exactly. He ought to be proud of what he's doing and advocate publicly. This is what I do. You should too.
Yes. Meanwhile, I noticed that, I don't know, have you joined the lawsuit by the American Civil Liberties Union that says the government massive surveillance program under the NSA is creating what amounts to a national gun registry? When they have records on all citizens.
We're on a number of suits, and I do believe that we are on that one. Yes. Every once in a blue moon, we end up on the same side as the ACLU, and typically it will be Fourth Amendment related, due process related. And when they're consistent with that belief of theirs, then we're happy to work with them.
Well, that, of course, was not the focus of the ACLU. I remember once when Ira Glasser was head of the ACLU, I was chatting with him, and I asked, could you cite for me one case where the ACLU has stood up for people's Second Amendment rights?
Lowell, Ponte, we're running out of time. Obviously, they'd have to think long and hard. I hope people will
get the free book at 800-630-1494.
Excellent. 2 years after Columbus, folks, 800-630-1494. Lowell Ponte, thanks so much.
Hey, God bless you, Larry, and God bless America.
Our right
Thank you.
to keep and bear arms have never been under as much attack. And gun owners of America are fighting daily in Washington to protect that right. This program, Live Fire, keeps you up to date on that fight. GOA is the only no-compromise gun lobby in Washington. Live Fire is hosted by GOA's Executive Director, Larry Pratt. Be sure to join us next Saturday. And remember, it's not just about gun control. It's about control.
In the spirit of gun control, will you disarm your entire security team?
We'll get right back to you.
You'll get
Came
back
over
to me?
very friendly.
Would you like a sip of my soda?
Very friendly body language. They're grabbing on him. Grabbing on him, dragging him away.
Why can you defend yourself but not
pushing him back?
The majority of Americans? I mean, look at the team of security you got. And you're an advocate for gun control? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 5. I'm counting. There are probably more.
The Bill of Rights protects every American's God-given right to keep and bear arms. Now that right is being seriously undermined as legally registered rifles are being confiscated in some parts of our country. If we're not careful, we may find ourselves with no right to own guns. And that's where Gun Owners of America comes in. Gun Owners of America is in Washington every day fighting for you to keep that right. Congressman Ron Paul has called GOA the only no-compromise gun lobby in Washington. You need to be part of this great grassroots group of activists who are keeping the heat on their members of Congress. Find out right now how you can join. Call 888-886-GUNS and get started receiving their fact-filled newsletters and action alerts. Call 888-886-GUNS or go to their webpage at gunowners.org and help make your voice heard in Washington. Make that call right now and call Gun Owners of America at 888-886-GUNS. Remember, it's not just about gun control, it's about control.